Hello again. Now, on day 207 of this year, South Africa's electricity woes are not over. This week, the country will surpass the record-breaking 205 days of power cuts that were recorded last year. Companies continue to suffer financial losses as a result. Last week, steelmaker ArcelorMittal announced it's lost billions of rand due to the blackouts. The country's largest iron producer, Kumba Iron Ore, also expects to record lower sales due to logistics challenges resulting from these power outages. Let's speak now to Chris Hattingh, who's head of policy analysis at the Center for Risk Analysis. Chris, good afternoon. I mean, there's no doubting of the impact that load shedding, the ongoing load shedding, is having on our economy, let alone on the big industries and important ones like mining.
Good afternoon, Dan, and good afternoon to the viewers. You're absolutely right to highlight that. And maybe in the day-to-day, we get caught up in the issues of the day. And if you look at trend lines over time, given, for example, the country's unemployment story, the lack of economic growth. I mean, not to be facetious, but just yesterday, the International Monetary Fund, they revised our growth outlook for this year upwards from 0.1% to 0.3%. And that's for the economy as a whole. That's not focused on things like manufacturing and mining, which are heavily electricity dependent. According to a new report from Stats SA out recently, over the last 16 years in manufacturing, you've lost over 300,000 jobs in that sector alone. And that's largely as a result of not having reliable electricity supplies. So over time, these things build up and they eat away at sort of economic confidence, investment, and job creation, and then ultimately to the detriment of the majority of South African citizens.
And there's still no light at the end of the tunnel, really, to speak of, although Electricity Minister Kgosientsho Ramakgopa tries very hard to tell us things are stabilizing. I mean, the return to service, for example, of Unit 1 at Koeberg nuclear power plant has been moved back and back. It was supposed to be in July, then it was moved to September, now delayed to October. That's going to continue to really hamper any efforts to grow this economy.
Absolutely. If you look at Koeberg itself, around 1 unit of that nuclear station supplies just over 900 megawatts. So that's effectively one stage of load shedding that could go quite a long way to helping. So I think Eskom on their side trying to do everything they can. But to point to the light at the end of the tunnel, and I'll even try and give you more hope in that regard, that it's not at the end of the tunnel, but it's coming closer and closer. And that is the move towards renewable, not off-grid capacity, but sort of more private sector generation and capacity. Now, the risk here and the downside is not everyone can afford to install solar, for example. So not everyone is going to benefit from this immediately. But the more we can get that pipeline of solar projects, of wind, of renewable energy going, taking pressure off of Eskom's power stations, of Koeberg and the others, take your pick at the ones that don't function as they should, the more pressure you can take off Eskom, that gives them more time to do maintenance, for example, to get the very basics working. Then when they get that again going online, then you can see the benefit for the majority of citizens in terms of just basic energy generation. You still got constraints around the grid, around transmission, but we are seeing movements in the positive right direction, as it were, despite maybe the best intentions of central government. I think businesses, citizens, trying to really make the best of the situation in which they find themselves.
Chris, to mitigate the risks that these big industries are facing, like the ones we're talking about today, Kumba Iron Ore and ArcelorMittal, and of course others in the mining industry, should they not themselves invest in alternative sources of energy?
No, absolutely, and I think they are. One can drill down into the specifics for each one maybe, but especially in mining and manufacturing, you can't just wait and assume the best case scenario where you'll only be on stage 1, for example. You can't run your massive iron ore smelters with that lack of reliable, consistent electricity coming through. So I think that capacity building is happening. It's, of course, a long-term thing, depending on your size, on your mine, on your manufacturing operation. These things are not going to happen overnight, but not even within a couple of months. So I think those plans, many of them would have already been talked about over the last 2 to 3 years. And then the breaking of ground has to happen, the environmental impact assessments all that sort of stuff, and then you bring those online. And of course, for mining, manufacturing, those projects, when they do come online, they can also not just benefit the mines themselves, but the communities around them in a sort of more integrated feedback into the grid kind of way. So you hope that you start to see that happen. So I'm not trying to say that I see the lights at the end of the tunnel, maybe at the end of this year, but purely based on that you need that reliable electricity for things, large-scale industry like mining and manufacturing to happen. Those plans will have been put in place, and you're seeing them at various stages of implementation. We just hope that they come online sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, and our rail network also needs electricity to get those locomotives moving with the goods to the harbors. And logistically, the mining sector is not just facing this load shedding problem on itself, but also on that value chain of transporting like iron ore to the harbors. Transnet is not coping.
No, I think you're exactly right to highlight that. And it's not just, it's easy for us to maybe focus on these sorts of big companies and their yearly or their half-year financial statements. And we say, oh, they're going to lose 2 billion here and 2 billion there. Look at the wider impact, the sort of ripple effect on the economy, on job creation. It's not just that business, even though that business is very important, but what is the impact on its suppliers, on people that it engages with? What about the supermarkets that buy certain products? What about farmers, the impact of load shedding on them, and all the costs that they have to factor in? They have to factor that into the operation somewhere. And eventually, in some ways, those costs then get passed on to the consumer. We talk about this in the context of high inflation. The Reserve Bank can do what it can with hiking interest rates to try and protect the value of the rand, mitigate some of the issues of inflation. But you've got these supply side drivers of inflation, those failures in terms of energy, logistics, for example, fuel prices driving up those business operation costs. So a very delicate operation, any business, a day-to-day operation in terms of balancing these risks and these costs. But I think with logistics as well, we have now news around some agreements now between the Port of Durban and a company based in the Philippines. Let's see what that agreement, what everything entails. What are the timelines? What are the deadlines? Who's responsible for what? Are you going to see some skill sharing and some better capacity building coming online now? And as you start to change that and you see maybe more freight moving in, that also helps to change the perceptions and the narrative. And then you'll see the positive effects of that across value chains and across supply chains.
Yeah, I want to go back to where we started. ArcelorMittal, when they were speaking about their results, they made a comment that they underestimated the impact of load shedding on their business. You and I, households, we get irritated. If we don't have any backup, there's no power. We can't watch our favorite soapy or do whatever we want to do on our laptops, those who can afford to, or just the normal day-to-day household chores that require electricity, like the simple boiling of water in a kettle. Have we generally, when you look at the risk and analyzing things, have we as citizens, as business owners, just as society, underestimated what Eskom has done to this economy?
I think we underestimate maybe the long-term effects and the sort of sentiment, how it affects national sentiment and economic sentiment. So for an international investor, when they invest somewhere, that capital, they expect some sort of return on investment. And when you look at big picture stuff in the global context, where inflation is higher now, growth is lower, those international investors, capital markets, all that capital, that fixed capital that we want in South Africa to create jobs, those look for avenues maybe where things are operating a little bit better, so maybe not in South Africa. So again, that means downstream more negative effects. If we can start to change some of that around now, again, alleviating the pressure on Eskom, getting business generation going, that could assist. But here also is the I don't want to say the responsibility, but the opportunity, the avenues for innovation and solutions from the business and civil society side. So not just waiting for things maybe to come to be solved from Pretoria. We hope that happens in terms of policy reform, but also as on a more granular, local, municipal, provincial level. How in your given area can you tackle some of the challenges in partnership with those around you in that sort of long-term sustainable solutions-based idea? So it's not just a case of I'm going to solve things for me in a silo, but I want to work and integrate with those around me so that things are over the long term better for everyone, which in turn is better for the economy and for job creation. And you mentioned the sort of impact day to day on things like we can't watch our favorite soapies. I mean, that's just another risk point for me with Seven Dalan being cancelled. That's another another thing for me to deal with, so that I can't watch that once it is now off air. So I have to deal with that as a personal issue. I'll need to find something else to try and watch once that's gone.
Yeah, the impact of this is really big and wide-ranging. Thank you very much, Chris, for your time and insights this afternoon as we look at the real impact in terms of risks of the ongoing load shedding by Eskom.